February 17, 1917, 6:12 hours, Atlantic swell off the coast of southwest Ireland. A tramp freighter wallows, her stern lower than it should be, smoke drifting from a hole near the bridge. Men scramble, shout, and tumble into a boat, oars biting the gray water. The lifeboat pulls away, fast, too fast, leaving the helpless ship to her fate. On the horizon, a low, mean shape breaks the surface and angles in, deck gun uncovered, crew at the ready. The submarine closes the range, certain and slow. One more easy kill on a year already swollen with them. The freighter's colors hang slack. The ocean is quiet enough that you can hear the click of a breach. Then, in a single breath, everything turns. Bulwarks fall, canvas drops, steel flashes. A white ensign snaps from the mast like a switch thrown. The panic party has been theater. The U-boat has been lured inside the trap. In 1917, Germany would sink more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The number mattered because the war at sea was a war of subtraction. Subtract enough cargo and coal, and you subtract an army's strength on land. But on this afternoon, in this patch of water dotted with gulls and shattered planks, subtraction would run backward. What looks like surrender is a weapon. By spring 1917, the fighting in Europe had become a logistics duel wearing the mask of a stalemate. On land, armies expended shells by the million for yards of churned mud. At sea, a single torpedo could erase 1,000 tons of grain, 200 horses, a month of coal for a factory. Submarines multiplied the leverage of scarcity. Their commanders hunted cargo more than warships, because cargo fed armies and ran motors and moved guns. But every submarine had a weakness. To sink ships efficiently, it usually had to come close. The laws and practice of war at sea during those first years, prize rules, the old rituals of search and warning, had trained captains to surface and deal with merchantmen face to face. Even after Berlin authorized unrestricted submarine warfare, commanders still conserved torpedoes. Torpedoes were expensive. Deck gun shells were cheap. The trick was to make a merchant ship stop, then pound her from a few hundred yards, or board her, or plant charges. The trick worked, until the day the merchant ship had been built around the trick. The British called them special service ships. The press and the public called them Q-ships. They looked like tramps and fishing smacks, colliers and coasters. They were, in fact, stage sets screwed to steel, false deck houses hiding 12-pounders behind sliding panels, dummy masts and collapsible bulwarks, cargo nets concealing depth charges, secret telegraphs, a thin cord to the ensign halyard placed beneath a boot heel. Each carried 2 crews, the panic party, who would enact a frantic abandonment, and the fighting party, who waited, silent, sweat-slick, unmoving, in the darkness behind screens, listening to shells walk up the hull and splinters hiss across the deck. Their logic was grim and simple. If the U-boat approached to save torpedoes, it traded invisibility for proximity. At close range, even a small battery of well-handled guns could kill a submarine before it could dive. A single punch at point blank could turn the hunter into scrap. Another punch could keep it down forever. Rewind to March 1916. A Q-ship named Farnborough, commanded by a young gunnery officer turned deception artist, tacked through rain squalls off Ireland. Her profile was intentionally pathetic. A mousy little tramp, paint scuffed, deck cluttered with faked cargo and odd planks, an open boat lashed sloppy along the rail. Her crew drilled on 2 scripts, chaos and violence. They practiced tossing fake documents in panic and capsizing a boat in clumsy haste, then sprinting back through scuppers to their hidden stations. They learned to want the enemy closer. It went against everything that had kept sailors alive since sails first rose in war. They learned it anyway. When a periscope feathered the water abeam and a submarine surfaced 1,000 yards off, Farnborough did exactly what she was built to do. She slowed, she limped, she threw over deal planks and barrels as if lightning ship. The panic party went down the falls and pulled away, all elbows and shouted nonsense, all perfectly placed. The submarine closed to finish with its gun. Farnborough let the range collapse to inside the danger line. A boot heel released a rope. The white ensign broke. Panels dropped. Gunners fired in a single wave, training and drill distilling into seconds. At 300 yards, steel becomes final. The U-boat's deck gun crew went down in the first salvo. A shell punched into the hull along the casing. Another split the conning tower. As submarine steel flooded, the captain still tried to put her under. She sank in sight of the men who had lured her there. What happened off Ireland in 1916 was repeated in variations across the western approaches and the Bay of Biscay through 1917. Q-ships were not numerous. The Royal Navy did not have the luxury of mass. It had an appetite for effect. They were small bets scattered along a long front. They cost less than cruisers and corvettes because they had the hulls of civilians and the weapons of the light fleet. Their currency was surprise. Their interest rate was fear. To understand how these helpless freighters reversed ambushes, look closely at the catalog of deception they carried. A ship must look wrong in the right ways. A fresh coat of paint could be a giveaway. Rust streaks and patched plates were a better signal. Fish barrels stacked near the quarterdeck meant trawler, not trap. A coat hung on a rail, a crate lashed crooked, a coil of line placed exactly too near a hatch. These were a grammar of weakness. On many Q-ships, the forward well deck hid the main gun under a split-hinge bulwark. When the signal came, the sections fell outward and the muzzle rolled into a cutout with only inches to spare. Secondary guns hid behind screens disguised as scuppers. There were apertures cut through deck houses to allow a gun's traverse without anyone seeing the shadow on the deck. Telescopes were mounted low behind vents to allow a quartermaster to watch without peering over a rail. In that world, a glance could cost a minute. A minute could cost a ship. The men who made the theater credible were the panic party. Their job was to sell fear. When a shell punched splinters from a hatch cover, they made noise. When a round marched through the bridge wings, they flung papers. They walked to the falls, fumbled, shouted, dropped kit, rowed off, and then, out of sight from the U-boat, turned and waited for the signal as their mates stepped into the light behind the gun shields. If the submarine was cautious and held off, the panic party would raise a ragged distress flag, pull back and lie low, and the Q-ship would list a few degrees or pump smoke to be more convincing. It was choreography performed under live fire. February 17, 1917, tied the method to a result. A submarine, confident, deliberate, eased in on a wounded tramp and found itself inside a point-blank ambush. The opening salvo took the deck gun. A second found the conning tower seam. Men who had been spectators for the first minute became wreckage in the second. The boat tried to back down into safety. A third volley shaved away the time she needed. Oil came to the surface, bits of wood and cork. A black circle widened on the water. The Q-ship's crew kept firing until the black circle became the shape of certainty. They felt the recoil of their guns as something like rescue, not salvation. War had trained that word out of them, but rescue from helplessness. For months they had been told their only role was to be sunk and counted. Now the count could go the other way. But these reversals did not come cheaply. Even when the ambush worked, the helpless ship usually took a beating. A shell into a bunk room was a man's life, even if the trap succeeded. A round into the bridge could cut controls. A jammed helm during the reveal might swing the muzzle out of arc and leave the submarine a lane to escape or to smash the gun with another hit. There were times the U-boat did not fall for the set at all. Sometimes a commander stood off at 2,000 yards and fired patiently, or submerged and lobbed a torpedo from the safety of mathematics. Sometimes the bait was taken and the hook missed. Surprise has a half-life. Late April 1917, west of Britain, a small, shabby auxiliary steamer drifted with the look of a ship halfway to the bottom. A submarine closed, careful and ready. Shells walked up the deck. The panic party sold the show with such conviction that seamen taking cover on the U-boat's casing shouted with laughter and pointed. When the panels dropped, laughter turned to stillness. The first rounds disabled the gun. The second tore open the conning tower. For a minute, the water boiled with fragments and men. The U-boat slid under. The decoy's crew believed they had sunk her, certain in that moment. The auxiliary herself was sinking, water clawing through split plates, pumps clattering. She limped away and reached a harbor. Only later did the story bend. The submarine had not died there. She had limped home too, carrying her own dead and wreckage, a scar made of steel and salt. Even when the prey survived, the method worked a larger change. Each time a U-boat commander nursed a wounded boat home or took casualties from a ship that should have been easy, the arithmetic of the Atlantic shifted. It told skippers that the cheap kill was sometimes a trap, that the safe economy of gunfire could cost the boat itself. It suggested a policy-level outcome disguised as a tactical exchange. If you cannot safely approach strangers, you must spend torpedoes. If you spend torpedoes faster, you mount fewer patrols. If you fire without warning to stay alive, you stiffen the enemy's will to convoy. Deception at the scene of one sinking rippled across the entire war of tonnage. June 1917, the Western approaches again. Another decoy drifted, smoke staining her stern, her rigging an amateur's snarl. The submarine tracking her was one of the mine-laying type, shorter-legged, cruelly efficient around busy shipping lanes. She surfaced perhaps to take a prize, perhaps to save a torpedo. The decoy played hurt. The panic party shoved off. Minutes stacked, not too many. Time was a weapon too. The moment came. Ensign up, panels down, crash of guns. A shot smashed the submarine's forward casing. Another took the conning tower. Another the base of the periscope. The boat tried to dive and could not. Water entered at the wrong angle. She sank stern first, leaving debris and faces in the water, some angry, some stunned, some simply trying to live. The decoy fished survivors from the sea. That was also part of the script, because the Royal Navy insisted that once the trap was sprung, once the enemy was beaten, the men in the water were just sailors again. But the ethics of illusion at sea were more complicated than the end of a gunfight. Q-ships sailed under false names and wore neutral flags until the moment of engagement. That was legal under the customs of the era, provided the true colors were shown before firing. Many captains followed the rule exactly. Some chose to bend it. Stories circulated, some true, some distorted in the retelling, of men shot in the water, of flags not changed in time, of lines crossed in spray and anger. The Admiralty defended the strategy as necessary against a ruthless campaign. Berlin decried it as a kind of murder with fancy props. Neutral observers argued by the inch on whether a state that fights in disguise can expect its enemies to abide by any rules. At sea, rules live or die on whether they keep men alive. The hard military truth sits between the outrage and the myth. Q-ships never dominated the war. Their production line was too artisanal, their risks too personal, their results too dependent on the judgment of the other side. They did not, by themselves, beat back the submarine threat. They did something subtler. They made the easy tactic harder and the cheap tactic costly. They bought time and doubt. They wrote stories that countered a feeling spreading through dockyards and waterfronts, that the sea belonged only to the hunter now. When convoying finally went from idea to order in May 1917, escorting destroyers and sloops, paired with aircraft spotters and decoys, dropped merchant sinkings month after month. The curve that had been arcing upward bent the other way. U-boat captains found fewer loners and tighter screens. Patrols grew longer and more dangerous. The special ships, sometimes lost alongside the cargo they imitated, had helped force the change by tormenting the old habits that made submarines efficient. You can trace the cause and effect like a wake line. Early war, merchantmen are stopped and searched, warned and shelled, often after a polite signal. Result, surface approach is common, deck guns do much of the work. British response, build theaters that kill actors. Result, caution spreads. Some commanders still try, some die, some live to warn others. German response, torpedo first, ask later. Result, outrage spikes, neutrals anger, British political resolve stiffens, convoy becomes unavoidable. Allied response, shepherd ships in guarded lanes, flood approaches with small escorts, fill the air with eyes, lay down mine barrages. Result, the U-boat becomes the hunted more often, the tonnage graph staggers, the arithmetic that made destruction cheap starts to fail. Q-ships stand at the hinge point, a small lever moving a heavier door. Inside the ships, the human math was not clean. Guns hidden behind flaking paint needed men to work them. Men had homes. The men who stayed behind the panels while shells walked the deck did not move for art or for a thesis. They held their breath and learned to balance stillness against survival, counting the seconds until the officer's hand chopped downward and the ship became what she had always secretly been. They memorized a rule that contradicted everything a sailor's nerves taught him. Do not flinch, do not peer, do not startle too early. A blink against a splinter could be the giveaway that cost the ambush. Courage became something different here, less about charge and more about the discipline of waiting while death patted the deck for you in a blind man's search. Listen, for a moment, to how quiet that waiting could be. The gun crew crouches. The sights are preset for the guest range. The captain's face has no color. The deck sobs with the impact of a shell through the forward hatch. Someone far forward groans. A kettle swings from a hook where someone left it as part of the set. Paint flakes off a panel as if winter has moved inside the ship. Outside, the submarine's gunners argue about elevation. A trickle of water edges past a bulkhead seam. The captain raises his hand. No one breathes. He drops it. Loudness returns, and with it the relief of being allowed to do something. By mid-1917, U-boat commanders had adjusted their own scripts. The smartest of them, men who had studied the pattern of decoy fights, stood farther off and used optics and patience rather than swagger. They mapped the silhouettes that most commonly hid guns. They suspected the odd slump of a freighter's stern, the too visible lifeboat, the gravelly convenient drift across the wind. They learned to watch for the telltale, a crew that runs from a midship's fire but leaves a stern boat suspiciously overmanned, a distress flag that goes up too smooth. In that chess game, the decoys answered with variants, new disguises, new gun placements, fake men wired to move by rope, logs to serve as drift cargo, smoke pots to sell a mortally wounded boiler. Each move brought a little more shock, a little more waste of the enemy's nerve. The period from spring to autumn 1917 becomes a film you can cut back and forth, micro to macro, cause to effect. Frame by frame, a decoy reveals and fires at 30 cables, conning tower cut, oil rising. Cut to an Admiralty plot room in London watching dots on a chart narrow into convoy lanes. Cut to a submarine captain reading his orders about conserving torpedoes and then ignoring them because his nerves remember the time the Helpless trawler exploded gunfire at 2 cables. Cut to a merchant skipper at the tail of a column signaling engine trouble and the escort making a hard decision in a moment, the kind of moment deception helped create. Is it a straggler? Is it bait? Do we circle or do we hold the line together? Across those cuts, the story coheres. Deception is not a trick, it's a policy in miniature. There is a secondary ledger, awards and funerals. Decoy work bred citations for calculated courage, the kind that asked men to stand where they could not duck. Decorations went by the book and sometimes, in rare and specific cases, by ballot, a crew choosing which of their own would wear a medal given to them all in spirit. The same ledger recorded the names of the men who died when a set failed or a torpedo arrived before a rope could be cut. It was not equal. No ledger in war ever is. But it was argued that the arithmetic of saved ships that reached Liverpool and Cardiff, and the Clyde with wheat and shells and coal, was worth the gamble. The climax of this story is not a single sinking, but a recognition. We opened on a violent reveal. We end on a systemic one. The Helpless freighters had been billed as a tactical answer to a tactical problem. How do you kill a submarine that refuses to play by old rules? The reveal is that they were more than that. They were a pressure tool, a way to force the other side to change how it spent its resources and how it measured risk. The hunters switched to torpedoes sooner and more often, not because of a memo, but because the lesson had been driven home in splinters and funeral parties. Closing to a range that felt like cheating could instead feel like suicide. The thesis, in one line, in a war measured by tons and time, deception reshapes the math. After that recognition, the arc of the campaign is easier to read. Convoy, once resisted by merchant interests and some naval officers as cumbersome and slow, became the backbone of Allied maritime survival. Escorts multiplied. Air patrols, clumsy at first, found their search patterns. The broad minefields of the North Sea penned submarines or injured them badly. Sinkings of merchantmen fell month by month from the spring peak. Even as more U-boats went to sea, their average haul per patrol dropped. Commanders who had once chosen their targets at leisure now had to find them in guarded lanes and endure depth charges if they came too near. Q-ships did not make convoys possible. Convoys made Q-ships less necessary. That is the quiet success of a deception system. If it works, it erases its own rationale. The technique did not end with the armistice. 2 decades later, when another war set the Atlantic boiling, navies revived the decoy idea. Some worked for a while, but the ocean had changed. Sonar meant you could hunt invisibly with sound instead of with a hunch. Radar and aircraft could deny a place for surface tricks to live in daylight. Torpedoes were more plentiful, and U-boat doctrine rarely required a captain to surface in sight of an unknown silhouette. The age of theater on the ocean had passed. Yet the lesson remained. When an enemy's efficiency depends on a pattern, it is worth spending sweat and steel to make the pattern dangerous. Return now to that February afternoon off Ireland. See the lifeboat rowing away, frantic and loud. See the submarine edge in, a machine among men. See the officer's hand poised over a line that will turn the flag from neutral to true. Watch the panels fall, the guns blink once as if surprised to see light again. The first shot is hurried and still hits. The second is perfect. The third is unnecessary, but no one on that deck knows it yet. The submarine folds, oil blots the sea. The gulls come back and hang in the air because sailors are throwing things over the side again, but now those things are life belts. What looks like surrender turns out to be a decision. Not despair, but design. Not a last gasp, but a first move in a larger fight. The ambush belongs to whomever writes the script. The universal rule here is not about flags or tricks or maritime law. It is about leverage. Wars are decided by the side that turns the other's habits into liabilities. Not the biggest gun, but the wisest use of expectation. Not through brute force alone, but through forcing the enemy to spend more for less every time he chooses to act. In the end, those shabby British freighters were more than bait. They were an argument, in steel and smoke, that even in a world of torpedoes and tonnage, intelligence and nerve could make a trap out of weakness. And every time a U-boat took that bait and died within a few hundred yards of a ship that was supposed to be helpless, the ocean said it plainly with the quiet that follows a gun's last echo.